In 1991, late October afternoon, I'm out in the backyard with my son, who's about 4 years old. Because it's Texas, it's 85 degrees, we're sweating. The leaves are turning brown and falling down, and he looks up at me and he says, "Is this fall, Daddy?" And these are the falls that I remember growing up in the Northeast. I know there's, no offense to my Texas friends, I know there's a lot of pretty places in Texas. That was not one of them where I lived. And I made the decision to move back. The problem is that I had a company in Texas, and it didn't make sense to move the company. Most of our clients were in the South and Southwest. And I literally had the thought, if there are companies that have a headquarters in one state and a branch office in another, they can do it, why can't I? Now this was in the 90s, before the internet made this very popular, very easy. They used to overnight me data tapes so I could see what was going on. The company, I'm going backwards, sorry. The company was called Video Rental Services. We sent movie libraries to apartments as a marketing tool. If you rented an apartment, you could borrow the movies overnight for free. I don't even think we had this website in 1993, but we eventually got one. You can see how beautiful it looked. That's actually not uncommon for most websites at that era. And the interesting thing was, when I moved, I was able to grow the company and work less. And looking back, I can tell you why that happened. I was able to systemize things and get other people to do the outputs that are required. You have to be careful when people tell their own stories of their own companies, because it always looks good, and especially true on Twitter. What I don't always tell you is the time I had to fire my general manager and hire another one from 1,500 miles away. I don't talk about the time that a competitor stole my marketing materials word for word and my onboarding materials word for word. I don't talk about the time that a national company came in, put ads in all the trade journals that they were going to do exactly what we were doing for half the price. You know, this stuff happens. This is the normal stuff of running a company. But what it allowed me to do, because I could systemize things and because I could get myself out of the day-to-day work, it was the best decision of my life. Company kept growing. My accountant said, "Hey, move to Russia. It's doing great. Maybe it does better without you." I said, "Okay." And then I got a call from somebody who said, "You should look into this thing called coaching. You would be great at it." And I said, "What's that?" Coaching hadn't become a buzzword. But I got into it, I liked it, and I ended up with a bunch of people founding the International Coach Federation. I was their 4th president in 1998. And that has allowed me to indulge my curiosity in learning how companies work. I love learning about the business models and the different things. I don't know if I'm Curious George in this picture or I'm the guy with the yellow hat. It doesn't matter. But today, I want to share with you some of the things I've learned from running my companies and from working with clients and learning about their companies. But before I do that, I have to say thank you to SMBash and for giving you a copy of my book. Some of you were here last year when I was running around with little cards saying, "Give me some ideas about what I should call this book." And some of you have helped me with that. If you can take a picture of this QR code, what I'd really love is that you go to Amazon and leave a review. We're trying to game the algorithm. And it turns out that the Amazon algorithm, if you get a certain number of reviews, I don't know exactly what that number is, I've heard it's around 100, then it will start promoting the book internally. You know, those places where it says, if you bought this book, you might like this book. That's what they're going to do. So I would really appreciate that. You are in for an amazing couple of days. You will wish you were 2 people. Because as somebody was saying, there are 2 tracks. I think it was David. There are 2 tracks today. There's the searcher track, people looking to buy companies or buy another company, and there's the operator track. How many are searchers? Looks like a little over half. How many are operators? That looks like the rest of you. Maybe, so I guess we're about half and half. Maybe that was a little more on the operator side. I want to say something to the searchers. You have to understand operations, because when you buy a company, Even if you aren't the operator, it has to operate. Because deals are sexy, but the money is made in operations. And if it's not running well, it's not going to make your bank happy. It's not going to make your investors happy. And ultimately, it won't make you happy. So I want to focus today on the dilemmas of running a stage 2 company. And immediately that should bring two questions to mind. What is a stage 2 company and why do I care? Well, the reason you should care, I'll go backwards, is that you will be buying, most of you that are buying, you searchers, will be buying stage 2 companies. And those of you that are running companies will mostly be running stage 2 companies. And that will make more sense to you when you understand how I look at these stages. In order to do that, we have to take a step back and say, why would you hire anybody? About 10 years ago, it was very popular to say that small business owners are the job creators of our economy. I've worked with companies across the United States and Europe. Nobody has ever said to me, when I get up in the morning and go to work, I want to see how many jobs can I create today. In fact, most of the hassles that I hear about and that I've had in my own companies come from employees. We would much rather automate, get contractors. Business owners really don't like to hire employees. Even though we like our employees personally, that's not what we do. Why do we hire people? The job creators are our customers. Our customers demand stuff that they want to pay us for. Can you believe that? And so, in order to serve them, we have to get to the point where we hire people. So it's that demand of customers that's why we hire people. And we think, well, I hire somebody to fulfill this role or to do this job, to do this work. But you really don't hire them to do work. You hire them to produce the output of that work. And if they could do the output in half the time, you'd be happy. When you think about that, outputs are created in two different ways. They're either created by people who are experienced and intuitive and really get stuff done, or they're created by a process, a system. The first one I call grandma in the kitchen who has no recipe but makes wonderful food. Holiday meals are terrific, birthday meals are terrific. You cannot scale a restaurant with grandmas. They're hard to find, they're expensive. You get two of them in the same kitchen, they probably wouldn't agree on anything. And so people who build companies like that have a hard time scaling. The other way that those same outputs are produced is by a process or a system. And this quote, moving your company from people to process, is a maturing stage of a company. I got that line from Melissa Withers, who runs the Rev Up Fund. And there's a great quote by Daniel Jones, the chairman of the Lean Enterprise Academy, about lean thinking and lean manufacturing. He says, brilliant process management is our strategy. We get brilliant results from average people managing brilliant processes. And we notice that our competitors often get average or worse results from brilliant people managing broken promises. So average people are much easier to find than brilliant people. But in order for them to produce, you have to have the brilliant processes. When you do that, as your company grows, what you find is that these systems, these processes subdivide. And so you'll have multiple subsystems where the output of one feeds into the input of the next. And as these proliferate, you may end up with dozens, hundreds, sometimes even thousands of subsystems in a relatively small company. But that's what it takes to move the company forward. And so you think, well, how am I going to keep all this in my head? And what typically people do is they resort to an org chart. And I'm going to say that's not the best way to do it. Because an org chart is people and roles, and the roles are a very poor proxy to the outputs that you actually hire people to do. If you look at the outputs that an average person in your company is producing, there's probably 6 or 7 of them. And some of them only loosely relate to their role or their title, but all those outputs are important. The best way to think of it as a group in your company is that those outputs fall into what I call 7 buckets. The first bucket is you have to serve customers. You have to make something. You have to provide a service or a product that they want to pay for. And there's a whole lot of systems and subsystems that go into producing these outputs in the serving bucket. Then you have to find those customers, and you have to sell, and you have to convince them to give you money for what you're making. And then there's a number of buckets I call the sustaining buckets. And the purpose of those buckets is to promote more serving and more selling. And these buckets become the people bucket, hiring people, managing people. The money bucket, you have to pay the bills, you have to collect the money, you have to do a lot of analysis to find out what kind of amazing insight is in your financial numbers. There's an information bucket, which is making sure that everybody has the right information to do their job. And then CAFE is a checklist of things that if you don't pay attention to them, they could bite you in the butt. It's kind of like getting your blood pressure checked, getting your teeth cleaned. You know, that's not going to help you run a marathon, but it may keep you from dying when you're doing one. So these are things that you want to check on a regular basis. And the 7th bucket is scaling. It's growing the company. It's being able to sell and to serve more. So with that background, we can finally talk about stages. And there is a continuum of companies as they grow from stage 1, stage 2, and stage 3. And I got this concept from a guy named John Brown who wrote a book on exit planning, saying that a stage 1 company has very little value in the company itself when you go to sell. Stage 2 has more, and stage 3 has the most. And I'm writing, I've got a piece coming out Monday night in my Substack. You can sign up here, it's free, that goes into a little ebook of these stages in much more detail than I can get to today. But what I want to tell you is that a stage 1 company, what I looked at, how I define these stages, is what is the person at the top mostly doing? In other words, what bucket are they trying to fill? And with a stage 1 company, the buckets that they are filling are selling and serving. They are customer-facing activities. They're out there serving customers, finding new customers. They may have employees, but in general, the employees help them do those 2 things. At the other extreme, you have a stage 3 company. Stage 3 companies are your holdcos, your regional or national powerhouses, and the person at the top of those companies is looking to grow, looking to scale. They're looking out into the industry, saying, who should we buy? What market should we go into? What are the new trends coming that we need to take advantage of? And so these 2 companies, at the 2 extremes, stage 1 and stage 3, the person at the top is outward focused. In one case, they're outward focused directly on customers. In another case, they're outward focused on the industry. But in the middle is the stage 2 companies. And as you can see from this color, it's not exactly a cutoff where it turns from blue to green to yellow. And likewise, as your company grows, there's not one day you wake up and you go, oh, I'm stage 2 now. You know, oh, I'm stage 3 now. It's not like graduating from college where, oh, I've got the diploma, I'm done. But there are some different things that you can see. And if you look at, as the owner or as the CEO or the person at the top, if you look at which bucket they're trying to fill, that will help you out. And the stage 2 companies are internally focused. And it's a big shift from going externally focused on customers to internally focused on building the organization. This is a very hard shift from outward to inward. And this is why you might want to buy a company at that point where you can put those systems in place and take it to the next level. This is why a lot of companies stay small. I have a 120-year-old house. I get a lot of contractors that I need help with. And most of these people have no website. And it boggled my mind. Like, get a reference from somebody, oh, you ought to hire this plumber or this concrete guy or this whatever. And I'm like, okay, let me look them up. They are not there. And yet they get incredible reviews. And I say to them, why don't you have a website? And they say, I don't want any more business. I got all the business I need. I have a crew. I take vacations every year. I'm making some money. I don't want the headaches. They're stage 1 companies. And that's fine. Because that shift is hard, some of them stay small. Some of them hire people, the grandmothers in the kitchen who do really good work, no systems, but the stuff is getting done, and they run away. They pull out. They're absentee owners or absentee-ish owners. And many people buy those companies. Many of the searchers that I work with have bought companies like that. And the seller is not really that involved in the day-to-day stuff. But the people are, but they don't have systems. And now the new buyer has to say, how do I scale this thing? Some business owners just grind it out. They just, working 60, 70, 80 hours a week, and then they get to a point where there's got to be a better way. Do you remember this meme? How many of you ever saw that one? I finally found out what she's saying to him. She is saying, it's okay to stay at stage 1. You do not have to grow your company if you don't want to. Now, this works much better if you don't have investors and you don't have bank debt. They may have a different opinion of what you need to do. But because it's hard to grow, the solution to moving into a stage 2 company or moving from early stage 2 to later stage 2 is to build systems. To look at the outputs that need to be produced. And if you buy a company like this, I assume if you get a bank loan, it's profitable. And it's working. The outputs are being produced. Your challenge is to figure out how they're being produced and to systemize them. Because this is hard, you can't keep it all in your head. The solution is not to get a big head. The solution is to document your systems. Take that wisdom and experience out of people's heads, out of grandma in the kitchen, and say, Grandma, tell me how you do this. I want to capture that recipe. And there's some great tools now that you can do this with. This is particularly hard with knowledge work because knowledge work often happens on a computer or it happens in somebody's head, and you have to get that out of them. There's all kinds of tools now with videos and all kinds of other things that you can do. Loom videos, what's the other one? Screen share. Those are great for stuff that happens on the computer. Those are great for something that happens on a machine. There's a company I know that has, they have a shop doing cabinet work. Alex Forbes posts on Twitter a lot with it. They have a thing called Gemba Docs, where it does the documentation of how to run each machine, and it puts a little QR code that they can print, and so the operator of that machine just scans that QR code, and all the stuff comes up on their phone. There's a lot of cool ways to do this. But you have to get that stuff out of people's heads. The biggest dilemma I see with stage 2 is that you have to zoom in and zoom out and zoom in again and zoom out again, and you have to go from micro to macro of how these outputs are being produced. And what that means is you're kind of like this. Have you seen those? This, I think, is called a Hoberman sphere. It's a toy, and you can expand it to about this big, and you can scrunch it down to this big, and all the pieces are just on hinges. And that's what you have to do as the operator of a stage 2 company. to move in and to move out. And there's a story that motivational speakers tell. You're walking down the street, you see a guy with a hammer and chisel hitting on rocks, and you say, "What are you doing?" And he says, "I'm making bricks." And you walk a little further down the street, and there's another guy who looks exactly the same, hammer, chisel, rocks. Say, "What are you doing?" And he says, "I'm making a wall." And there's always three guys in these stories, so you go to the third guy, hammer, chisel, rocks. "What are you doing?" He says, "I'm making a cathedral for the glory of God, and it's just going to be amazing." And the motivational speakers say, you want to be that third guy. You want to do the glorious thing. You want to do this incredibly big vision. And I say, if you're building a company, you want to pay attention to those bricks. Because if the bricks aren't square, if they're not uniform, if they're not strong, the wall is going to crumble. The cathedral will never get built. But as a stage 2 owner, you have to go from the vision back to the bricks and back again. And the solution is the pattern that I've seen. We don't zoom in enough. We don't zoom in deep enough. So we have this vision. We say, wow, going to build sunflowers from here to wherever. Great vision. The thing about visions like this, you can be very imprecise. How many sunflowers? Millions. Well, that's a big range. But I better zoom in. And I better look at, what does that one need? What kind of fertilizer? What kind of sunlight? What kind of water? How do I do that? In my experience, that's not enough. You have to zoom in a little further. And maybe even a little further. And eventually, you get to, that's where we need to be. That's where the bricks are made. That's where the outputs are being produced, at that level of detail. And then, of course, you have to zoom out again and get the vision. And it brings to mind a quote by Herb Kelleher. Who knows who Herb Kelleher was? Few of you. He started Southwest Airlines. It was due to an anomaly of the Texas laws at the time, but he took advantage of it. And Southwest Airlines, up until the pandemic, was the only airline that had a profitable quarter every single year. In fact, at one point, Warren Buffett, I think it was, calculated the fact that the entire airline industry had never been profitable. There were, some companies made a little bit, some didn't. They merged, some went out of business. Southwest was profitable until the pandemic every single year. And this quote, think small and act small and we'll get bigger. Think big and act big and we'll get smaller. I actually don't know what he meant by that. But I took it to mean, pay attention to the bricks. Zoom in, get small, make sure that's happening, and then we can get bigger. And it's these systems that build bricks. The outputs that you want are why you have the system. And the system itself is how it gets done. And there's 4 parts to every system: the trigger, the input, the transformation, the output. And this is a simple example: payroll. The trigger of payroll is a day. You usually do payroll every other Thursday or whenever it happens. Other triggers are other things. Some triggers are an event, some triggers are a condition, but it triggers this system. So the input of the payroll system is the hours people work, their salaries, deductions, all that good stuff. You send that off to the payroll company or the payroll department, and they do the transformation, which takes the input and turns it into the output. So they do all the calculations, net pay, and the reason that you do payroll is for the output. Money goes to the employees, reports go to management, taxes get filed. It's a very simple part of those 3 of the 4 stages, 4 parts of a system. Let's take another one that looks this simple: accounts payable. It looks like, well, maybe we pay bills twice a month, whatever you decide to do. So the input is the vendor information, who we owe money to, what the amount is. The transformation is we do all the calculations, cut a check, do a Venmo, however you make the money go there, and the output is the money goes to the vendor, and your accounts payable goes down. Looks simple, looks like it's just like payroll, but it turns out, you go, wait a minute, I've got somebody doing this. How do I know that they're not paying their brother-in-law as a fake vendor? That's one of the simplest ways that businesses get ripped off, is a fraudulent vendor. And then you go, wait a minute, there's some weeks that I don't have the cash to pay all my vendors. I'm going to bump this one out to next month or next week or whatever. And so you realize there's actually two subsystems here. There's system one, which is approving the bills, and the output of that is these bills are approved to be paid right now. And that's the input to the second system, which actually does the paying. And to keep fraud out of your system, you'd like to separate these and have two different people doing them. And what you realize here is that there's a piece of judgment between these two systems. So as you're working through your head or your people's head, how they do their work, when you get to a point where they say, well, then I decide, or then I make a judgment, or then I use my experience to figure out whatever, that's a key. And the key is that's probably a subsystem. And at that point, you can break those two things out. And then you can do one of two things. One is you might be able to train somebody else how to use that judgment. So I was talking to a guy in the HVAC business, and he told one of his people, he said, I don't want to order all this stuff that we need anymore. And I'm going to cut back. We had 27 vendors. They cut it back to 6. I want you to order this stuff. Guy said, great, I'll order it for you. So he outsourced that system. He forgot to tell him, you have to keep in mind how much cash we have. So he ended up with like 6 months supply of this and $60,000 of money that he didn't really want to spend because he forgot to tell him that one little critical piece of judgment. And sometimes, so that was a very simple thing actually for him to go, oh, wait a minute. When you do the buying, here's the limit. Here's how you apply that judgment. Sometimes you can't get that judgment off to somebody else. And so then what you can do is outsource the first part to the person who has the judgment, and that's all they do. They just sit there and make that judgment, but they don't have to do any of the prep work. There was a guy, orthopedic surgeon in Pittsburgh, passed away a couple years ago, named Freddie Fu. And I don't know if he was the first ever to do this, but he certainly was one of the first in Pittsburgh, where he had 2 operating rooms going at the same time. So a patient would come in, and he had a separate crew that would prepare the patient, open them up. Freddie would come in, do his magic, leave, go clean up. Meanwhile, there was another operating room, another patient's ready. Freddie would go in and do his magic in that second one while somebody else was closing down the first patient, and repeated this way. He couldn't replicate his judgment, his skill, but he could outsource, in a sense, delegate the rest of the stuff so that that's all he did. So that's another way that you can make these systems produce more for your company. Whenever judgment is involved, that's a key. What we found is that with the first part, sometimes you can automate that with software. Sometimes you can hire people offshore or in other areas where it's cheaper to hire people to do that part, and so you don't have somebody doing all that other stuff. I was talking to somebody about this, and they said, oh, you mean the grunt work? And I said, well, it's grunt work to you, but to them it's not grunt work. And there's a concept when you do this that everybody gets to play at the top of their game. I have a client who's a lawyer, and he was hiring some paralegals, and he said, in my experience, the people who are the best paralegals have come from a tough background. And they have broken out of their upbringing, and they have achieved a measure of success to be a paralegal. And he said, they're great, people with that background. And I said, yeah, because that's the top of their game. But if you've been to law school and somebody hires you to do paralegal work, that's not the top of your game, and you feel like it's grunt work. And so if you put those systems, if you break them out, then everybody plays at the top of their game. Another example from healthcare, another guy in Pittsburgh operates the knee and hip replacement at McGee Women's and Children's Hospital. And he has a thing called patient-centered program where an MD is not allowed to do anything that a physician's assistant is licensed to do. And a physician's assistant is not allowed to do anything that an RN is licensed to do. And an RN can't do anything in LP. You can see how this is going. And what he found was the patient outcomes were better, first of all. And secondly, the cost was better because lower level people with lower salaries, less training, are doing more of the stuff that only they can do. And the people at the top are doing things that only they are licensed to do. Now, if you don't work in the healthcare community, you probably don't have licensure telling you where these divisions are. But that's your job as the owner or operator of the company, is to split that out and say, okay, wait a minute, you just do these things, you just do these things, so that everybody's playing at the top of their game. That's where judgment comes in to break out your subsystems properly. Let me give you another one. Has anybody felt like their email is this? It's one of the complaints I hear a lot. My day is overwhelmed by email. It's kind of like saying, a carpenter saying, my day is overwhelmed by hammers. Your email is a tool to get work done. But the reason it looks overwhelming is because it's not really like this. It's really like this. It's lots of little problems. And the reason I know that is because each of these subsystems has a different output. And the exercise that I do with people is to say, look through your emails for the last week or two or three and tag them by the kind of output that email requires. And you will probably find it's somewhere around 10. It may be 6, it may be 12. It's not going to be 500, even though it may be 500 emails. And so for each of these, you want to develop a separate system to produce that particular output. So you may have all these emails that are sales inquiries. That's one kind of output. Others may be complaints. Others may be billing issues. Others may be scheduling issues. Whatever they are, figure out what those outputs are for your inbox, and then you can start taking care of them. And you do that by describing each type of output, making a system for each, and assigning that system to a role in your company. I would encourage you not to assign it to a person, because if you lock it into a person, it's hard to promote that person. It's hard to make changes without going back to all your vendors or all your customers. Oh, yeah, the thing you were sending to Sally at blah, blah, now it needs to go to Mike at blah, blah, blah. Put it to the role so that the person can change and the role still produces the same output. And make generic email addresses as often as you can, so that somebody sends an email with a billing question to billing at your company, and maybe sales at your company. Or if your employees need to do a scheduling issue, have them send it to scheduling at your company. One of the tricks of this is that the first system of managing your email has to be triage, going through the inbox and saying, okay, what kind is this? What kind is this? What kind is this? Where does it go? That's the first system. And I suggest people have a hesitancy of, there's so much info, there's so much personal stuff in my emails. There's not as much as you think, first of all. But secondly, Get a private email. Have it be private at your company. Or one guy I know has his name twice at your company. And you can give that to your family and to your friends and to certain people that you know that's only going to go to you. But the other stuff you can have somebody else do. When they do this, don't ever have them delete it. Have them send that email to another inbox, archived, taken care of, whatever you want to call it, so that it's always there and you can go back. The generic email addresses handles it by role. Use software. In Gmail, they call it labels, filters, other things that automatically segregate them. And then the last tip for making this work is design it for the bell curve. What the bell curve says is most of the up scale here is the number of things that happen. And this is the definition of the kinds of things. You are not likely to do well planning for absolutely every single outlier. Plan for most of them. Plan for the 85, 90% of them. But you have to make sure that your system doesn't lose those outliers. That when something is an outlier and it's not handled by any of these other things, that it goes somewhere that somebody looks at it who can handle it in a timely manner. So that's one of the ways that you can break your email monster down, get it taken care of, get it by somebody else. So here's some takeaways from today. One is duplicate systems make your company scalable. When you have systems, you can have more people doing the same thing and you get bigger, more throughput. When you document those systems, you get better results from average people. And now those documents become your training program. Here's how you can train others to get that wisdom that grandma used to have, and other people can do the exact same thing just as well. When there's judgment involved, that may be a clue that there's a subsystem, and you can break those systems apart. And the subsystems mean everybody plays at the top of their game. People are doing the things that they are uniquely qualified to do. This also gives you a career path for people, because once you get trained to do the next level, we can move you up. Because if your company's growing, you're going to need more people at those other levels. You design for the bell curve, and the company needs systems. That doesn't mean you have to be the one that creates them. If this isn't how you think, find somebody that thinks this way, either in your organization, a contractor, bring somebody else in, etc. I want to tell you the solution to my video rental company. As I said, we sold movie libraries to apartments. And as you can imagine, I don't own that company anymore, because how many of you get movies from VHS tapes, which is how we started, or DVDs? This is actually the second iteration of the website we had. My wife was running the company by that point. She had better design sense than I did. And this company hit its peak in the early 2000s, was dwindling. I saw the internet coming. I'm not stupid. I said, this is going to end. We just ride this out, take as much cash as we can. It lasted way longer than I thought. By 2016, we had lost the lease of our warehouse. We'd been there 17 years. We still had 130 customers. We were down to 2 people, 2 employees, and the last year we just basically made jobs for them. They were the only ones that made any money. But I was reluctant to give up 130 customers. As an entrepreneur, it just goes against my religion. And we figured maybe we could get another year out of it. We couldn't find a place that would give us a year's lease. I said to my son, who lives in Colorado, and likes to ski and doesn't like to work as much, and he's a great salesman. He does a lot of good consulting when he needs to, makes some money, goes back on the slopes. I said, if you can find a place, he lives in Leadville, by the way, which is the highest elevated incorporated town in the country, 10,000 feet. I have to go to Denver for a day to acclimatize before I go see him. I said, if you can find a place that has a flexible rent, You can run this company you get another year out of it. You can do the work that these two guys were doing and make all the money they were making and still have time for skiing. He said, great. Moved it up, found a place. And he was tougher than I was. There were some customers who were kind of a pain in the butt. And he said, I'm tripling your rent, your fees. Take it or leave it. And a surprising number of them took it. But it still kept dwindling. At one point, it was down to one group of 9 customers, and he had moved it to his house by that point. Had a room upstairs. He was doing this thing. And he was working one day a month and making a little bit of money. And Leadville, the rents are going sky high because of the vacation area and a lot of Airbnbs, and so the local workforce can't afford to live there for the most part. And he was very sensitive to that. And he found a local agency who said, we want to rent your house for 6 months, and we want to serve people like battered women who need shelter for a couple of days or a week, and we'll move them in and out. We'll take care of everything. We just need you to be gone. He said, great, I'll live in my camper. That'll be fun. What worked for a little bit till his girlfriend said, why don't you come to move in with me? And that was okay. But he called me up and he said, I have to shut the company down because I have to move out of my house. And I said, you have a job, a business. This is more like a job, but a stage 1 thing at that point. And you work 1 day a month and you make money. Somebody will pay for that. You could sell this thing. And he said, really? I said, yeah. He said, huh. So he actually sold it. He found somebody to buy the company. This was 2019, 2020 maybe? It was a little later than that, I think. About a year ago, I read that Netflix still had a part of their operation where they were sending DVDs out in the mail. And they were going to shut it down last September, I believe. So I called up my son and I said, is video rental still going? He said, oh yeah. She's the person who bought it. She's running it. I said, you know what, son? We have outlasted Blockbuster and Netflix DVDs. So that's the solution to that story. And I think that's a pretty good success. So let's stay in touch. Thank you very much. You can find me on Twitter and on email. And thank you for being here.